What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I think it's important to start with this list, which at the moment is the sort of meta-defining list of the game, and I think that that is the best place to start in most metagames when we're trying to explain what the hell is going on. The easiest way to explain this metagame is to say that this list has about 8 times more plays than any other list tracked on Untapped in top 10% Infinite. This is, of course, the list that I use to hit rank 1, and I think, to me, it is a very brute force application of the Cannonball Mercury synergy. Now, I do like that the Fenris Wolf is in here, but there's plenty of room for people, I think, to improve on this shell, to modify the Cannonball Mercury Fenris stuff into other shells, and to generally just start experimenting with that rather than just relying on the brute force approach that I employed here. There are a couple of upsides to a deck like this. One is that I felt like it was very favored into the 34 Card Monte decks, just a very, very favored matchup that I would not feel nearly as good about without the Wiccan stuff. And of course, I also felt that in a world where everyone is not fully prepared for what this deck is capable of, it is going to be able to smash people. The other advantage that this deck gets is an advantage into other mid-range decks. You're going to see decks talked about today that are like Werewolf by Night decks, right? These are like Werewolf by Night Agamotto decks, Werewolf by Night Annihilus decks, and that's really cool. It's a really cool synergy with Merlin and all of that stuff. The bad news is, I think people are going to expect me to say, oh, Mercury shuts it down. That's not the problem. The problem is, they literally cannot beat a Mercury Cannonball Fenris Wolf. It just can't happen. So what this deck does is sort of sit at the top of the mid-range decks and say, nice investment you've made. It would be a shame if it went away and then I got the investment you've made. It's a deck that sits near the top of output, or at least in terms of preventing output for mid-range decks, and still has some reasonable game into combo decks. There are some really bad matchups, though. Like Cerebro, very difficult for you to get anything off against. Decks that are willing to throw priority against you and somehow are also able to play through Goliath, there's not a ton of those, but if they do come up, they will get you. Goliath does a lot of work here in large part because if you can't throw priority, you need a different hammer at the end game, and that is what Goliath is doing. The major addition that I have noticed from Merlin in the metagame is not just that he's popping up in a bunch of random places and being pretty solid in a lot of those random places, but mostly that he's managed to revive Werewolf by Night in multiple shells. There are 2 dominant Werewolf by Night Merlin shells right now. This is the first one. It is the one that Honifer cooked up, the 16-card Agamotto version of this deck, and I think this deck gets a lot out of not being particularly well known, because once people are fully prepared for it, it starts to be a little bit more iffy. They're like, oh man, there's no shag in here, I can just do whatever I want. But the stats this deck can generate are very, very high. Annihilus goes great with Merlin, but also all the things that go with Annihilus go great with Merlin. You have all of these cards that make a ton of sense in different contexts, right? So let's say you play a Hood. That's a card that makes a ton of sense if you want to Annihilus it over to your opponent. Okay, but it also makes a ton of sense if you want to use one of the Merlin spells to polymorph it or flip it back into your deck for energy. Okay, but it also makes a ton of sense if you want to use it as an Images of Icon target, right? There's just a lot of overlap between these strategies, and because there's so many on reveals in the deck, as you keep doing all of these various overlapping strategies, your werewolf gets larger and larger and larger and larger and larger, and so you're doing things that are otherwise reasonably fair, but you're consistently outputting something kind of messed up, whether that be sending over a void, or transforming a void into a 5-drop, or just like all of the stuff this deck does goes together very well. Surge gets to be a little bit of a glue card in it. You have extra stats in the form of Agamotto when you really need a bigger number to win a lane that the wolf is not in. Just a very cohesive package of cards. I've been trying to find a good deck for Infinity Ultron, and this is about as close as I have gotten. I've really enjoyed playing this list, but I do feel like it's the kind of list that exists in a metagame defined by other mid-range decks, which is to say it's very aimed at being a good deck into those other mid-range decks, and not so much aimed at doing what can beat a combo deck. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like having a Mobius if I run into Mr. Negative. It feels great. But if I run into Cerebro, I'm not doing much if this is what I'm looking at, right? And so this is a deck that has a bunch of unknown information in it. Just a massive amount of unknown information. Your job is to leverage it. They shouldn't know why you're snapping. They shouldn't know what your Infinity Ultron is doing. You get to ramp out your Infinity Ultron on 4. You get to use that extra energy very, very well in a deck like this because of the amount of cards you put back into your hand or copy or any of that kind of stuff. Using Frigga here as like a synonym for put into hand, I realize that might have been a little bit confusing. I have found great success with this, so if you're looking for an Infinity Ultron list, I think this is a very good place to start. One of the major characteristics of Marvel Snap metagames is that when they're undeveloped, decks like this are much better than when they become developed. And it's worth pointing out that decks like this were pretty playable in one of the most developed metagames we've had, which was the previous Thanos-dominated meta. People were still playing this and still succeeding with it. With so many changes to the game in such a short amount of time, it's hard for people to figure out how best to utilize these new cards. We're still figuring out the best Infinity Ultron deck. We're still figuring out the best Cannonball Mercury deck. There are plenty of contenders for those spots, and I'm going to be talking about them as well. This deck has nothing to figure out. It's just doing something stupid every single game. It's very consistent at doing that. And it's also a deck that is naturally good into inconsistent-ish mid-range decks. The decks it struggles with the most are the decks that are consistently outputting the same number of points every game. Predictable decks. It struggles with Sauron, for example. It'll struggle with Cerebro if you don't have any interaction, right? You can't scam a Legion to, like, give them a 10-power monster off a monster island or something like that. Like, there are genuinely problems with most things that have reasonable, consistent outputs, but there aren't a lot of decks that have a lot of reasonable, consistent outputs. There are a lot of people experimenting and trying new stuff, and this deck is here to say, stop trying new stuff. I have more things than you. Don't try new stuff ever. How dare you even consider trying new stuff? Imagine thinking about trying new stuff. Ha! Idiot. I think a lot of people will look at the preponderance of Cannonball Mercury and say that means move bounce is dead. I do not believe that. I think, having played a decent amount of the matchup going the other way, I don't feel favored into move bounce as Cannonball Mercury. Like, yeah, Mercury's like a good card in the matchup, but it's far from a card that means that you win. It is not Mobius in the world that we're talking about here. It's just really good. Like, it's not Mobius, it's more like Red Guardian. Yeah? And that's a really good thing to have. I'm not going to sit here and talk down on Mercury. She makes this matchup much less scary. But I'm not really convinced she makes it favored. The fundamentals of the matchup between move bounce and basically any mid-range deck still go in the direction of move bounce. It's just sometimes you'll like screw them over, right? Like, not always either, because you're not always drawing it. You're not always drawing it on time. There are often trade-offs to playing it, and you might get the lane wrong too, because the earlier you play it, the more you have to guess what lane you actually want to shut down. And I do think that this deck took a meaningful hit from Mercury. It got worse. I'm not going to sit here and act like it didn't, but I still think it is quite good, and I still think it will likely be underrated because of the way the community thinks about tech cards being just a little bit off from what those tech cards actually are. This is not Mr. Negative Mobius. It just isn't. And Mercury's going to be helpful, but not helpful enough to make this deck go away. I gotta admit, I did not have the genius idea to come up with this deck. This was someone in the Golden Gauntlet tournament who genius deck building play here. His name is 785CM, and the genius deck building play is just sort of take a gauge of sentiment around Marvel Snap and try to figure out what cards everyone hates, and then just put them all in the same deck. This is sort of the apotheosis of Tech Thanos in the sense of, like, there is not a single card in here that anyone likes. There's just, it's all cards people complain about at this point. It is 100% mono complaint cards. And frankly, that's not a bad strategy, because the reason people complain about these cards, as an expert complainer, I complain the most about something when it's beating my ass. And this deck has a bunch of cards that just beat people's ass. It is doing things that are very good across a bunch of matchups. It is perhaps maybe not like the most amazing genius deck building play I've ever seen, but I do think it actually is smarter than people are giving it credit for. This is a deck that has theoretical answers to a bunch of stuff. What I'm worried about is your baseline. When you draw well, this deck is immense. When you draw poorly, and there are more games where you draw poorly after the nerf, you are taking a hit. Not having a Sam Wilson after his nerf means that your Mockingbird is notably weaker. It also means that your Strange Supreme is notably weaker, who also got nerfed. This is a deck that I think has like legit potential, but I don't really think it's at the same level that it used to be. This is just another deck going through the growing pains of figuring out where Cannonball Mercury is actually good. We've talked about the 16 card Anni, but the 12 card Anni is very solid as well. Just a solid, consistent deck. Obviously, it loses a bit on the high-end version of high rolls when you are not playing Agamotto. Agamotto definitely increases your ceiling by sometimes decreasing your floor, but this is still a list that has a lot of baseline power in it. You have Merlin, and of course he goes with Werewolf by Night. We've talked ad nauseum about the way the Annihilus package synergizes with Merlin. He's basically like, imagine if Cersei was better and cheaper. Exactly what you want out of this. Even the other synergy that this package has with Merlin, and this is a little more pronounced in the Agamotto versions, but it's still prominent here. Sometimes you like have like pretty predictable 4, 5, 6s, right? Or like you're not really able to, if you draw your sentry late, get anything good out of it. That 2 extra energy, that Merlin spell that gives 2 extra energy, it's actually pretty incredible here. And it also clears up space for your wolf to keep jumping around. Like, he's doing a lot here. He's very good. This is a Stefan's list of Supergiant, which I'm putting on here largely in deference to play rate. I think this deck is pretty poorly positioned right now, mostly because of how many people are playing the deck I hit rank 1 with. This is just not a deck that wants to play against Big Brother Wiccan when the Wiccan also has access to Alioth and Negasonic. It's not fun. You don't want to do that. Very interesting deck, though. The other thing I'll say about this list is it is punishingly difficult to play. Like, there are not free wins in this list until you are very familiar with how the deck plays and what you need to do and what your opponents are going to do. This is an interaction-heavy list, even if you're not playing all of that interaction, because so many of your plans are entirely down to what is my opponent's possible range, and you don't have anything that goes drastically over the top. Every game you play with this will be close unless you're getting super blown out. For this reason, if you're going to play a Supergiant deck, I think I like the Rabbit Sweet version of Supergiant just a little bit more. What this is doing is mixing in a Wiccan shell, so you get to be Big Brother some of the time, but also Ronin, in a world where a lot of people are playing Merlin and filling their hands up, is going to be just a very, 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 very big guy. And having a very, 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 very big guy is very, very, very helpful in winning games against these other decks. This deck, though, I worry has a similar issue to the Annihilus and, of course, Agamotto decks, which is when you run into the Fenris Cannonball Mercury stuff, having a big guy starts to be really unfortunate. And it starts to be the kind of thing that makes you feel really sad instead. I like this. I'm just worried about whether it just sort of gets hard gapped by, like, if the Cannonball person draws well. Another place people are exploring Cannonball is this list. There were two people at 6-1 in the Golden Gauntlet with it, and I will say I'm going to give another shout out here. I'm forgetting the name, but there was someone else at 7-0 with a Thena Profex version of like doing a similar thing, right? Like we're trying to figure out the place for Mercury Cannonball to be. There's definitely a bunch of different shells to figure it out. I am fairly confident that one of these shells will eventually rise up and supplant my Wiccan shell. That seems like the most likely outcome to me. I don't exactly know which one it's going to be, but this is the one that caught my eye because it managed to keep Eliath in the deck. And keeping Eliath in the deck is, I think, actually something that is quite important. This is a deck that really wants to, ideally speaking, you want to lose priority with your Cannonball deck, and that means that Eliath is what punishes other Cannonball decks. That's kind of how this starts to go, because you want to be able to be like, oh, okay, I'm guaranteed blowing up the biggest thing in the lane. So I do think that this shell is really promising. I like that it's just a bunch of good cards. They correctly identified that you need the Eliath in here for the other Cannonball matchups. I think there is a lot to love about here. The one thing that I don't love about it is that there wasn't a way to fit Fenris Wolf in, and I understand why there wasn't a way to fit Fenris Wolf in, because you can't play the Fenris Wolf package here, right? And he's just going to be a 2-3, and you just like, I wish there was a way to do it. I understand why the deck building decisions were made the way that they were, and I have plenty of respect for it. I know a lot of people saw this deck at 7-0, piloted by Fudge. This is a deck that I genuinely enjoy the concept of. However, I do have some cold water to pour on it here. First up, I talked to Fudge. He says he thinks it's bad. He doesn't really understand why he's winning with it. I do have an explanation for it, though, because I personally believe that this deck, which I will call Millless Mill or what have you, is mostly trying to be an interactive deck that is prepped for various Cannonball Eliath shenanigans. And it does that mostly by A, blowing up Mercuries with Lady Deathstrike and stuff, but B, by putting a lot of power in its hand for late in the game. Your final turn, ideally, is like Demon, Demon, and Death, right? And if you're looking down the barrel of a Cannonball, well, you don't give them anything good to hit if you're playing Demon, Demon, Death, and you don't have priority. So that's step one, right? But like step two is you also don't give them anything good to Eliath. You're just playing stats. Who gives a shit if any of your death gets Eliath? It's already on the board. And so I think that's largely what this deck is leveraging right now. And I genuinely have no idea if Fudge was even aware of that. Like, I talked to him about it, and I'm not, like, he thinks the deck is, like, not as good as I think it is, which is weird because he's the one playing it. But I genuinely do think there is something to this in the way the metagame is sort of lining up. If people are playing a bunch of Cannonball, if they're playing a bunch of Mercury Cannonball, they're playing a bunch of Eliath, right? Not having priority and then just playing a lot of stats on the final turn of the game, importantly, stats that do not get Eliath, that's totally reasonable. I still believe that Cerebro 2 is likely the best quote-unquote combo deck in the game. I honestly can't think of a deck I would rather play against, or rather not play against, as the Wiccan version of Cannonball than Cerebro 2. This deck is a beast. Like, it is very inconsistent. I totally understand that. You lose to locations. I totally understand that. You lose when you don't trust Cerebro. I totally understand that. But there's just a lot of games where you just, like, you're unbeatable. You just absolutely are unbeatable. One thing you will notice is that there is no Blue Marvel in here. I got a little bit of pushback, but I think people are starting to realize Blue Marvel, not good. It's just not a good card in this deck, in large part because other people playing Enchantress means that you are in a pretty massive amount of trouble. It's the kind of thing you can get away with as long as you don't expect your opponents to either A, be playing Enchantress, or B, have two brain cells to rub together. But in a world where you have to be prepared for that, I just don't think it's acceptable to put Blue Marvel in this deck anymore. I'm very ambivalent about the choice of Bast in C3. It can be good, it can be okay. I think it's a reasonable enough thing to do. Ultimately, again, the issue with C3 is largely it has a bunch of good cards, but none of them are doubling the buff the way the stuff in C2 is. So C2 has a much more guaranteed level of output where, yes, you get screwed by locations, right? Like, you absolutely do that. You don't have a lot of location control. It does happen. But, and this is crucial, when it does work, your output is guaranteed. You have Brood, you have Lasher, you have Mr. Sinister, you have Goose to protect your stuff. You are able to actually say, I am going to do something stupid this game. I am going to know what my output is. I am going to have a large amount of output here because in C2 you have all of the things that carry the buff well. In C3, you have very little explosiveness, but a vast amount of tech. And that is really the difference between the two. C3 is much more slow and steady wins the race, but I think right now I prefer the ceiling and the consistency of C2. I gotta say, I'm very glad there were not a ton of people that brought Mr. Negative to the Golden Gauntlet because this guy is genuinely a little bit scary to me right now. I truly hope that I'm wrong in what I'm about to say going forward because, you know, I am playing a little bit of Mobius, but there's so little Mobius in the current metagame. This is a legitimately scary deck when there's a minimal amount of Mobius. Now, upsides, right? The Cannonball Mercury stuff does give mid-range decks game into Mr. Negative they previously didn't have. Totally real. The Eliath, being a much more common card, does give more decks game into Mr. Negative than they previously had. It is now no longer as guaranteed when you get to those final turns of the game after a Mr. Negative that you're going to win the way you might expect. All of that said, you still do a lot of winning when you do your thing here. And I do think that there is something to be said for being a deck that is able to do all this winning. However, it is a little bit less consistent in terms of full output after Mr. Negative than you might think. And it does still fall apart to a Mobius. So as much as I was afraid of this being a very good metagame for Mr. Negative, it looks like for now, we are probably not necessarily safe, but at least people are playing with new toys. Definitely keep an eye on this guy though. He definitely has me a little bit concerned. Discard is a very solid over-the-top combo deck in a world where the mid-range decks are just really mid-ranging it up and just trying to be, ooh, I'm going to be the out-mid-rangiest mid-rangey deck. Discard does have some legitimate upside. It runs into the Cannonball Mercury thing, though, a little bit. Like, not a lot. If you're able to diversify well enough, you're probably going to be fine. But in a world where it's like, okay, they play Wiccan, and then they Cannonball Mercury or Dakin on 5, and then on 6 they play Eliath. Those are the kind of things that can lose, right? And I think that's largely the dynamic that this video is speaking to, which is there are a lot of combo decks that are just generally a lot less guaranteed to win against Cannonball Mercury Eliath decks than they are against, like, every other kind of mid-range deck. Like, the Cannonball Mercury Eliath stuff gives these mid-range decks legitimately a noticeable amount more game into every combo deck. People talk about it like, oh, it's a move bounce thing. It's actually just a thing. All those decks are just a little bit better into the combo decks than any mid-range deck was previously. And I think that's largely the dynamic of what's happening currently. I genuinely think this deck is good. People are very low on it, and, you know, I get it, right? Like, it's boring, it's just got nerfed, but, like, it just does points very well, and it has a piece of interaction, and doing points very well, cheating some energy, interactive pieces, like, there's a pretty defined ceiling on this deck, but it's also a very good Cerebro beater. Like, there's just kind of a lot that this deck has going for it right now. But I think the number one thing it has going for it is it's just a very easy deck to play. And I think largely that's the reason why it sees so many nerfs. In much the same way as, like, Darkhawk decks got a lot of free wins off their opponents retreating, so they just looked like they were better than they were in some ways. Like, I personally believe that when they look at the data that they look at to make nerfs, they look at, I believe, the top 50% of players on the server. Not the top 50% of Infinite, the top 50% of players on the server. For those people, an easy deck is going to overperform a lot. My sense is that I'm not sure they control for that in a meaningful way, because they constantly hit decks that are easy with nerfs in a way that they do not hit decks that are hard. This is something we went through with Loki and Move Bounce previously. Decks that are very good at the top end of Infinite that don't necessarily percolate down are not their targets. This card, Sauron, and Surtur really kept getting nerfed even after I think a lot of people were like, I don't really understand why you're nerfing it still. My instinct is that that is an argument for this being the best deck to play to climb to Infinite. That's my instinct. I think it probably is the best deck to play to climb to Infinite because clearly they're responding to something when they keep nerfing this guy and this deck and this archetype. And I think what that is based on the sample size they're using, this is just a really easy deck to play with a lot of output, some good mix-ups, and just generally a lot of power. And if you're struggling to climb to Infinite, I think it is a very, very good choice. Another deck that I think is significantly better than people are giving it credit for is Living Tribunal, which is not something I really expected to say. The metagame is not particularly good for this deck. People are playing Negasonic, they're playing Goliath, they're playing Enchantress. This is not a good Living Tribunal meta. That's why it's on this part of the tier list. But what Living Tribunal has going for it, especially this build, is confusion. That's what it's got going for it. This is a deck that has a lot of confusion just built into it. And I mean that in a couple of different ways. Like, first of all, you can just lose to, like, Gore out of this build, which was created by Hella Enjoyer, the OG Tribunal guy in the first place. I think there is something to be said for a deck that applies pressure in such a meaningful way. Living Tribunal makes you scared. This is a deck that has the ability to threaten plays that are so game-winning you have to play around them. And because of the way this deck is built, if they play around your play around, you lose. And so this is a deck that has just a bunch of 50-50s built in. A lot of them are just reading what your opponent is going to do, but the power is there. And I think I would contrast that with something like Cerebro. This is also a deck that really stretches your math skills, where like Cerebro, it's very easy to do the math, right? Like, oh, it's 2. Okay, 1 Cerebro, it's 5. 2 Cerebro, it's 8. I can do math. It's very simple. This card is a lot harder to do math against. This deck is a lot harder to do math against. There's just multiple discounts you have to keep track of. It's very, very, very difficult, especially with Blink and things like that. And that's largely the advantage it has. People are used to thinking of Silver Surfer as an elite deck near the top of tier 1 or tier 2. The issue Silver Surfer has is one of getting outpointsed. There are a lot of decks that are just simply able to go over the top of it or to meaningfully interact with it in ways that make its points irrelevant. The mid-range decks have tons of effective points between Cannonball Mercury and their other pieces of removal. Cerebro is just doing what you do, but better. Surfer is in a position where it needs to build for maximal power. Now, this is a list that was put together, I believe, by a player named MSC and then a bunch of numbers. I play them on ladder sometimes, so I know they're on North America. This is what they took to the Golden Gauntlet, and I like it as a take on the deck, because this is maximal output Surfer. In a world where what we need is points, if we want to be able to justify playing this deck has points. There are multiple ways to get a Sarah out on turn 4. There are multiple ways to get to 6 energy on turn 5. Those are then moved into, say, let's play a Sage and then Frigga the Sage, or let's get a Gwenpool buff onto something and then Frigga that. That is sort of the thing this deck is trying to do, where it's like, we're using Frigga to compound the power of Gwenpool buffs, we're using Sarah to make sure we play all of our cards, because this is a deck right now, an archetype that needs every single point that it can get in order to compete. What's up? It's Destroy. Guess who's back at the end of the tier list? It's me, ya boy Deadpool. Yeah, I mean, I think this deck is as good as your early draws, and kind of as always, right? If you leave stuff on the board, it gets blown up. If you get Mobius, you get blown up. If you play a null early and it gets blown up, you feel really bad. But if you could just like keep Deadpooling and X23ing, and then your final turn is like Deadpool Death Null, that will beat an overwhelming amount of stuff. It really actually will. It's a playable deck, and that's about the nicest thing I can say. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Make sure you check out the Golden Gauntlet, which will be being broadcast as this video releases on the Marvel Snap Twitch channel. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. We'll see you in the next one.